Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her when she asked about the pericardial effusion building pressure around the unconscious SEAL's heart. Not a question. Not even a statement directed at her. He said it to the resident trailing behind him during morning rounds, loud enough for the entire ICU to hear, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for people who knew just enough medicine to be dangerous but not enough to understand their place in the hierarchy. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She continued adjusting the fall line on bed 7 without acknowledgement, her hands moving with the quiet precision of someone who had already forgotten worse insults than this one, who had learned long ago that the best response to contempt was competence so flawless it couldn't be ignored. Sarah Chen arrived at Mercy General at 1945 hours, 30 minutes before her shift, because 30 minutes of preparation was the minimum required to disappear completely into the night. She moved through the parking lot with the subtle awareness of someone cataloging exits, her badge clipped to scrubs 2 sizes too large, scrubs chosen deliberately to obscure rather than define. 7 years. That's how long it had been since she'd walked away from the Navy without telling anyone, without forwarding address, without explanation. She had simply become unavailable, and the system, fast and unforgiving as it was, had eventually stopped looking. San Diego seemed like a reasonable choice, a city large enough to swallow someone whole, a place where night shift work at a hospital meant no one asked questions about your past, no one needed to know you'd spent 3 tours as a senior chief petty officer managing trauma cases in Fallujah and Sanjin Valley, no one needed to know about the Purple Heart or the corpsman who didn't make it out of Baghdad. The ICU doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and she stepped into the controlled chaos of Mercy General's night shift at 1946. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like electrical insects, and the air smelled of antiseptic sharp enough to burn her nostrils, mixed with something underneath, coffee gone cold, the metallic tang of blood, the ghost of dying flesh. 3 nurses at the station looked up, nodded without really seeing her, then returned to their charting. That was the arrangement. Sarah worked nights not because she preferred them but because nights meant fewer attendings, fewer questions, fewer eyes cataloguing her movements. Nights meant she could work in the margins of the hospital's attention, saving lives in the spaces where nobody important was watching. She logged into the computer terminal at 1948 and pulled the census. 12 patients. 2 fresh admissions from the ER, 1 post-op spinal fusion sleeping off anesthesia, and in bed 7, a Navy SEAL with massive blunt force chest trauma who had been unconscious for 14 hours. She read the chart first, then read it again, her eyes moving across vital signs and procedure notes with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. His name was listed as Andrew Mercer, rank Lieutenant Commander, admitted through the ER after a motor vehicle collision on Highway 163. Ejected from the vehicle. Hit a bridge abutment at approximately 47 miles per hour. Massive pneumothorax, bilateral rib fractures, and the reason he was still breathing at all was the chest tube inserted in the ER that had reinflated his left lung. But something was building underneath those vitals, something the chart hadn't captured yet because the attending hadn't been looking for it. Sarah moved to bed 7 at 1952, the stretcher wheel squeaking slightly as she pushed through the curtain. The SEAL lay motionless, his chest wrapped in white gauze, a breathing tube disappearing into his throat, a ventilator beside the bed making its rhythmic whooshing sound like something mechanical still trying to convince his body to live. His blood pressure was 108/64. His heart rate was 96. On paper, he looked stable. But his neck veins were starting to distend, subtle but visible if you were trained to see it, if you had learned the language of dying bodies in a trauma hospital in a place 7,000 miles away. She placed her fingers on his wrist, counting pulse, feeling the slight flutter that wasn't quite normal, the rhythm of a heart beginning to squeeze itself to death because something was filling the pericardial sac around it, applying pressure, stealing room. Pericardial effusion. Building. She could feel it in the way his pulse wavered. She could see it in the slope of his jugular vein. And nobody had ordered an echocardiogram. Nobody had even written the words down on the chart yet. But they would. In about 18 hours, probably after he coded, probably when it was already too late. She had seen this pattern enough times to recognize it, the slow cascade of small oversights that led to dead young men on cold steel tables. She adjusted his full line, her movements economical, calculated. The gloves snapped when she pulled them off, a sharp sound like a gunshot in the relative quiet of the ICU at night. She was turning to leave bed 7 when the ICU doors opened again, and Dr. Hargrove stepped through at 0157, which was unusual because Hargrove didn't do early rounds. Hargrove did rounds at 0800 sharp, after coffee, after he had settled into his office and established that the morning belonged to him. But here he was at 0157, walking through the ICU like a man who owned it, his white coat impeccably pressed, a Rolex watch catching the fluorescent light with the kind of subtle gleam that costs more than Sarah's monthly rent. He was thin in the way of men who had never known actual hunger, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, his hair graying at the temples in a way his barber had probably spent 40 minutes perfecting. He paused at the nurse's station, and Sarah watched his eyes move across the ICU, categorizing, dismissing. He had already made his assessment of the night shift before he'd walked through the doors. Competent enough to keep people alive until real doctors arrived in the morning. Not important. Not a threat to anything that mattered. His gaze settled on Sarah for exactly 1.3 seconds. She knew this because she had learned to count time in fragments, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the milliseconds that separated safety from exposure. He saw a small Asian woman in scrubs 2 sizes too large, dark hair pulled back tight enough to stretch the skin of her face, hands that trembled slightly as she pulled off latex gloves. He didn't see the calluses on those hands, the way they had learned to hold other people's lives steady. He didn't see the scars on her forearms where shrapnel from an IED had carved lines through brown skin, scars she always covered now with sleeves even in the summer heat. He saw trembling hands and downcast eyes, and he smiled. The smile was worse than any spoken contempt could have been. It was the smile of a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected, who had just verified that the night shift nurse was exactly as breakable as she appeared. He looked back at the resident trailing behind him, a young man barely old enough to have a driver's license, and began walking toward bed 7. Sarah had already moved away, back toward the medication station, where she began unnecessarily organizing 4 bags in the refrigerator, her shoulders angled away, her eyes down, her entire body language communicating deference and erasure. It was an act she had perfected over 7 years. The mask of smallness. The performance of powerlessness. She had learned it in Baghdad, where being invisible meant being safe, and she had brought that skill with her when she disappeared into the margins of San Diego. Hargrove stopped at the SEAL's bedside with the resident, and she heard him speaking, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone performing competence for an audience. The resident said something back, something about the chest tube functioning, about output rates and oxygen saturation, and Hargrove nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose authority had just been confirmed. But he didn't examine the SEAL. He didn't place his fingers on the patient's neck. He didn't notice the beginning distension in the jugular vein, the subtle change in skin color that meant pressure was building, that fluid was gathering in a space where only air should exist. He didn't see it because he wasn't trained to see it, or perhaps because he didn't want to see it, because seeing it would mean taking responsibility for a difficult case, a case that might reflect poorly on his department if something went wrong. Sarah continued her unnecessary work at the medication station, her movements deliberate and slow, her breathing controlled. She had trained herself not to react to incompetence, not to let her face show what her mind was calculating. Back at Camp Lejeune, her commanding officer had taught her that the moment you let emotion show on your face was the moment you lost the ability to help anyone. Keep your eyes neutral. Keep your voice steady. Let them underestimate you until the moment comes when they absolutely cannot afford to. But the moment wasn't here yet. The SEAL was stable, technically. Stable enough to make it through the night. Stable enough to wait for the morning rounds, when real doctors would arrive. Stable enough, probably, unless something changed. She glanced up once, just for a moment, and found Hargrove's eyes on her again. He was still smiling. He said something to the resident, and the resident laughed, and Sarah turned back to her refrigerator, her hands absolutely still now, her breathing absolutely controlled. She didn't need to hear what he'd said. She already knew. Every hospital had a Hargrove. Every hierarchy had men like this, men who had learned to weaponize their position the way others learned to use a scalpel. The next words out of his mouth changed everything, but not yet. Not in the way he expected. Morning rounds at Mercy General started at 0630 sharp, and Dr. Hargrove moved through the ICU like a man accustomed to absolute deference. 12 staff members trailed behind him, residents, medical students, nurses, respiratory therapists, a small entourage that shifted and whispered in his wake. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless frequency overhead as he stopped at bed 7, where the Navy SEAL lay unconscious, chest rising and falling with mechanical precision beneath the ventilator's rhythm. Hargrove pulled the patient's chart from the rack with the flourish of a conductor raising his baton. Catastrophic chest trauma, he announced, loud enough for the entire ICU to hear. Massive hemothorax, bilateral rib fractures, myocardial contusion. We've done everything reasonable. It's time to have the difficult conversation with the family about quality of life and palliative care. He glanced around the semicircle of faces, gauging their reactions like a politician reading a room. I'm recommending we withdraw life support within 72 hours. Any objections? Sarah stood at the periphery, checking the monitor output she'd been tracking for the past 8 hours. The SEAL's intracranial pressure had dropped 3 millimeters since midnight. The cerebral edema was resolving. The swelling that had looked catastrophic 16 hours ago was now trending downward, measurable, quantifiable improvement. She'd been a senior chief petty officer in the Naval Medical Corps for 12 years before she'd walked away from that life, before Baghdad had broken her in ways she still couldn't articulate. She recognized the difference between dying and healing. She knew the curve of recovery. His ICP is stabilizing, Doctor, Sarah said quietly. The swelling is decreasing. Intracranial pressure was 24 at 0400. It's 19 now. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a defibrillator discharged, that brief, terrible pause before the shock. Hargrove turned to face her fully. His eyes narrowed with the expression of someone who'd just discovered an insect crawling across his dinner plate. I'm sorry, which medical school did you attend, Nurse Chen? His voice carried across the ICU with surgical precision. Or are we taking treatment advice from community college now? Laughter rippled through the residence. One medical student smiled and elbowed another. The attending physician, Hargrove's closest ally, shook his head with theatrical disapproval. Sarah kept her expression neutral, her hand steady, her breathing controlled. She'd survived 3 tours in Baghdad. She could survive this. Hargrove stepped closer. His cologne smelled expensive and chemical, like something designed to mask whatever lay beneath. Tell you what, sweetheart, he continued, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried more menace than shouting. I'm going to make you a little wager in front of everyone here. You question one more of my orders, one more, and I guarantee you'll quit within a week. He paused, letting the words settle like ash. $1,000 says you won't last. Anybody want to cover that bet? 2 board-adjacent physicians immediately laughed and nodded. The stakes were being established. The hierarchy was being reinforced. Sarah Chen, whoever she really was, had just been positioned as the challenge, the threat, the problem that needed solving. Sarah took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact with Hargrove. The silence stretched thin. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady count. Your hands are shaking, Doctor, Sarah said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. When did that start? The words hung in the air like a defibrillator charge, everything suspended, waiting for impact. Hargrove's right hand trembled slightly as he lowered the patient chart. His left eye twitched once. The room didn't just go quiet. The room held its breath. He recovered in less than 3 seconds. You're on thin ice, Ms. Chen, he said, voice dropping to something private, something dangerous. Very thin ice. He turned back to the gathered staff. Rounds are concluded. Residents, with me. Everyone else, back to work. The entourage dispersed like water flowing around a stone, but several of them glanced back at Sarah as they left, glances that carried curiosity, sympathy, warning. The veteran nurses had seen this before. The young residents hadn't. That made them unpredictable. Sarah returned to her charting station and didn't look up for the next 6 hours. The cafeteria incident happened at 12:45, during the shift change when the lunch crowd was thickest. Sarah carried her lunch tray, turkey sandwich on wheat, a container of minestrone soup, an apple, black coffee in a paper cup with Sarah written in blue pen, down the crowded aisle toward a table near the window. The lunch crowd parted around her like water around a stone nobody wanted to touch. Hargrove sat 3 tables away, visible only in her peripheral vision. She never saw his foot extend into her path. The tray pitched forward with the sudden gravity of a falling aircraft. The soup container hit the tile floor and exploded into a spreading stain the color of rust. The apple rolled beneath 3 chairs. The sandwich slid across tile in a neat arc. The coffee cup shattered, sending up a spray of dark liquid that would have been funny under different circumstances, the kind of pratfall that Hollywood built entire comedies around. Sarah's hands moved to catch something that was already gone. Hargrove stood. He extracted a patient chart from his shirt pocket. She recognized it immediately as belonging to the SEAL in bed 7, and let it fall at her feet with the deliberate precision of a man placing evidence at a crime scene. The pages scattered across the wet tile floor. He smiled down at her. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator confirming dominance. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said quietly, so only the surrounding tables could hear. "That's what you're here for." Staff members froze. Some looked away. Some watched with the rapt attention of people witnessing a car accident. Sarah knelt slowly, gathering the scattered papers with steady hands. The soup was still warm. It soaked into her scrubs, spreading across her thighs in a spreading dark stain. She assembled the chart pages in order, patient vitals, medication log, imaging reports, clinical notes, and stacked them on her tray beside the destroyed lunch. Hargrove sipped his coffee above her. He waited for her to look up. She didn't. She simply gathered the pieces and stood, her scrubs dripping, her composure intact, her eyes forward. "I'm going on break," she said, to no one in particular. "I need some dry clothes." 3 hours later, during shift change, Hargrove stood in the ICU hallway speaking loudly to a group of medical students. Sarah was just returning from documentation, passing close enough to hear every word. The problem with nursing today is that some staff members believe their 2-year degree qualifies them to challenge physicians with 20 years' experience, Hargrove was saying, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being right. "We have nurses who think they're diagnosticians. We have staff members like our little Florence Nightingale in there who seem to believe they understand cardiology better than, well, actual cardiologists." He gestured vaguely toward bed 7. "It's why we have protocols. It's why there's a hierarchy. Chaos happens when people forget their place." The medical students nodded. They were young enough to believe that intelligence flowed only downward through credentials. They hadn't yet learned that sometimes the person holding the mop understood the room better than the person wearing the title. Hargrove turned as if he'd just noticed Sarah approaching. "Ah, speak of the devil. I'm reassigning you, Ms. Chen. Effective immediately, you'll be handling all bedpan rotation for the remainder of the week. We need to rotate staff positions to ensure complete coverage. It's nothing personal." His smile suggested it was entirely personal. "You'll be working with our environmental services team, just until we can better match your skill set to our actual needs. I'm sure you understand." Sarah understood perfectly. She was being removed from critical care. Removed from proximity to the SEAL in bed 7. Removed from any position where she might question another order, challenge another decision, or save a life that Hargrove had already decided deserved to end. "Understood, Doctor," she said simply. That evening, Hargrove sat alone in his office with the door closed and his personal phone in his hand. The office smelled like leather and ambition and the faint cologne that always seemed to precede him. The clock on his wall read 1847. The city of San Diego was visible beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows, the bay catching the last of the sunset, the harbor lights beginning their nightly illumination, the whole landscape looking impossibly beautiful and entirely indifferent to the small dramas unfolding in hospitals and offices. His first call was to Dr. Marcus Webb, a board member who had benefited significantly from Hargrove's discretion regarding a malpractice incident 6 years prior. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Webb agreed to contact the hospital administrator. His second call was to the staffing agency that had placed Sarah, a temp service that handled short-term nursing positions. Hargrove requested a comprehensive credential verification on Sarah Chen, emphasizing concerns about possible falsification of qualifications, requesting copies of educational transcripts, background check results, everything they had. His third call required scrolling through his contact list. There. Jackson Compliance Services. He'd used them before to audit staff members. They were thorough. They were effective. They were very good at finding exactly what needed to be found. "I need a full chart audit," Hargrove said when the investigator answered. "Every chart this nurse has touched in the past 3 months. I need you to look for prescribing errors, documentation inconsistencies, anything that suggests unauthorized procedures or deviation from protocol. I'm particularly interested in any situation where she might have exceeded her scope of practice." He paused, letting the implication settle. "I suspect we have a compliance problem. Find me something actionable." He opened Sarah Chen's employee file after the call ended. There was her application photo, dark hair, steady eyes, almost no expression, as if being photographed by an institution was something she'd done before and expected to endure. Her emergency contact was listed as a P.O. box in La Jolla. The listed phone number was disconnected. Her educational credentials were from a community college nursing program, legitimate, nothing falsified, no irregularities whatsoever. Her work history before Mercy General was spotty. Temp positions, night shifts, contract work. She moved between cities like someone leaving breadcrumbs to throw people off her trail. What that meant, Hargrove couldn't yet determine. But he knew it meant something. He looked at her photo for another moment, then closed the file. She would be gone by the end of the week. The bet he'd made in front of the entire ICU staff would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. One way or another, Sarah Chen would no longer be a problem at Mercy General. And the SEAL in Bed 7 would die exactly as planned, and Hargrove's reputation for difficult decisions and unwavering standards would remain untarnished. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he actually believed he was right. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't feel like a villain. He felt like a man protecting his institution, maintaining standards, eliminating threats from below. The tremor in his hands that Sarah had noticed, the one that had appeared 3 years ago and only worsened, he attributed to caffeine consumption. He had no idea what it actually meant. The monitors started screaming at 1,447 hours. Sarah was restocking the supply cart outside Bed 7 when the alarm cut through the ambient hum of the ICU like a blade through silk. She didn't look up. She never looked up anymore. 3 days of night shifts had taught her the rhythm of Mercy General's daylight staff, and looking up was an invitation to be reassigned, questioned, watched. The tremor in Hargrove's hands had grown worse. She'd noticed it when he rounded that morning, the way his pen wavered across the chart like an old man's, but that wasn't her concern now. It wasn't her patient anymore. The attending physician on days was Dr. Morrison, a competent man in his 50s who'd stopped making eye contact with Sarah somewhere between Hargrove's public bet and the compliance investigator's visit. The investigator, a woman named Castellano in a suit the color of storm clouds, had appeared at 0600, documentation already in hand, questions already prepared. Sarah had provided the pericardiocentesis chart without commentary. 10 pages of her handwriting. Procedure notes. Vitals. The moment-by-moment recovery. Everything textbook. Everything perfect. Everything that proved she was something more than a night shift bedpan nurse. The heart monitor screamed again. Continuous high-pitched alarm this time, the kind that meant the rhythm had deteriorated further. BP's dropping, someone called out. Male voice. One of the residents. 78 over 40 and falling. The crash team was forming. She could feel the shift in the room's energy, the subtle recalibration when a patient went from stable to critical. Sarah kept her hands busy. Opened a supply drawer. Counted saline bottles she'd already counted twice. The boots were still in her locker, 30 feet away, across the nurse's station where anyone could see them. Where Hargrove could see them. She'd considered moving them 100 times. Each time she'd left them exactly where they were. Get me 2 large bore-fours running normal saline wide open, Morrison's voice, authoritative but not panicked. Good. Morrison was solid. Call for the ultrasound machine. I want to rule out effusion. Effusion. The word landed like a punch to the sternum. Sarah's hand stopped moving. The saline bottle hung suspended in her grip. She knew before the ultrasound rolled in. She knew from the clinical presentation, the sudden decompensation, the dropping pressure, the way the heart rate had climbed earlier in the shift in a manner that suggested the heart was working harder to pump against increasing pressure inside the pericardial sac. Blood accumulating. The sac tightening. The heart suffocating inside its own membrane. They'd missed it. Or rather, Hargrove had missed it and ordered everyone else to miss it too. The ultrasound tech's machine wheeled past her position. Sarah watched the screen from 20 feet away, watched Dr. Morrison lean in, watched the moment his expression shifted from professional concern to absolute certainty. The pericardial sac was distended. 3 centimeters of fluid compressing the heart. Classic tamponade presentation. We need emergency drainage, Morrison said quietly. Now. This was the moment. The instant that would define everything that followed, though neither of them knew it yet. Sarah stood at the supply cart, completely still, while the ICU transformed into controlled chaos around her. Residents pulling equipment. Nurses setting up a sterile field at bed 7. Someone calling for the senior resident. Someone else requesting conscious sedation, though the SEAL was already sedated, already unconscious, already in a prison of his own biology and Hargrove's negligence. Sarah didn't move. She counted to 3. Then she walked. Not to bed 7. Not yet. She moved to the medication dispensary, her hands moving through muscle memory that had been trained in field conditions where speed determined whether men lived or died. She pulled the 1.6mm needle from the kit. Grabbed the syringe. Antiseptic solution. Dressing materials. Every item arranged in the sequence she would need them, the way she'd arranged them 1,000 times before in rooms that didn't smell like antiseptic and fluorescent hum, rooms that smelled like diesel fuel and blood and the strange copper sweetness of combat trauma. The room went quiet. Someone had noticed. Several someones. Dr. Morrison turned, and whatever question was forming on his face died before it reached his mouth. Pericardiocentesis, Sarah said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Level. Professional. Not the careful, deferential tone she'd cultivated for 3 days of humiliation. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. We're not getting time for imaging guidance. Who? Morrison started. Sarah was already at the bedside. She didn't wait for authorization. Didn't wait for the attending to understand what was happening. She just moved. The SEAL's chest, the massive, muscle chest that had been pumping harder and harder as the pericardial sac constricted, was exposed in seconds. Her hands found the landmarks. Second intercostal space. She felt the ribs under her fingers like reading braille. Ribs that had expanded under fire. Ribs that had held a tactical vest and trauma plates and the weight of command decisions that had killed men less skilled than him. She swabbed the site. The antiseptic smell rose, sharp, clinical, cutting through the room's stale recycled air. Someone was speaking. A resident. A nurse. The words didn't register. She was in a different place now. A place where sound moved slower and her hands knew exactly what they needed to do. The needle went in smooth. 2 millimeters. 3. She felt the subtle resistance change that meant she'd breached the pericardial membrane, that infinitesimal shift in pressure that separated her from what came next. Blood hit the chamber immediately. Dark, not bright. Old blood, congealed, pressing against the heart wall with the weight of 3 days of accumulation. 30 milliliters. 40. 50. The heart monitor's rhythm changed. Not dramatically. Just a small shift, the way a door opens an inch wider and suddenly air flows differently. The SEAL's oxygen saturation began climbing. 72. 78. 84. The blood pressure held steady, then began its slow recovery. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. Sarah kept working. Withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd used to insert it. Applied pressure. Dressed the site. The movements were automatic because they'd been trained so deep that no amount of humiliation or reassignment or compliance investigations could reach them. This was muscle memory that predated the night shift at Mercy General by 17 years. This was what she'd done in Baghdad when casualties came in faster than triage could process. This was what she'd done in the deserts and the compounds and the forward operating bases where medical training meant the difference between a man going home and a flag-folded ceremony. The SEAL's blood pressure was climbing steadily now. 102/62. 108/65. The oxygen saturation had stabilized at 91%. The heart monitor showed a sinus rhythm that hadn't been visible 10 minutes ago, and Sarah recognized that rhythm the way some people recognize a face they'd known their whole lives. "Get me a chest X-ray stat," Morrison said, and his voice had changed. It wasn't the voice of an attending giving orders to a nurse. It was the voice of a man who'd just watched something impossible happen at his bedside. "And somebody needs to explain." "I'll write the procedure note," Sarah said quietly. She was putting the equipment back in order when the ER contract medic stepped into the ICU. He was young, late 30s, with the particular quality of bearing that marked him as someone who'd carried weight in places that mattered. Combat medic credentials usually showed in the eyes. His did. He watched her work. Watched her arrange the sharps container and the used dressings and the syringe with the same careful precision that had defined the procedure. Then he stepped closer, close enough that his voice wouldn't carry past the two of them. "You ran trauma ops in Fallujah," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's hand stilled. She was holding a used bandage wrapper. The fluorescent light above them hummed, a low electrical buzz that suddenly seemed impossibly loud. She didn't turn around. "I was 3rd Battalion," he continued quietly. "We worked with a senior chief." Her hands looked like that. He pointed at Sarah's scarred fingers. Her voice sounded like that. "She saved maybe 200 of us that deployment. People still talk about her at the company level." Sarah turned. His eyes were the grey-blue of Atlantic water in January. His stance was military in a way that couldn't be hidden even in civilian clothes. His name tag said Clayton, and something in the angle of his jaw suggested he'd made decisions he'd never be able to unsee. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said. "Yeah, you do," Clayton said. "And you're going to get fired for this." He glanced toward the SEAL's bed where Morrison was ordering labs and imaging. "Hargrove's been weaponizing policy since you got here. I've seen it before. Command structure protecting itself. Doesn't matter how good you are. Doesn't matter that you just saved a SEAL's life. What matters is you demonstrated competence they didn't control." Sarah didn't respond. She finished organizing the supplies with hands that were steady despite the way her pulse had shifted into something harder. Clayton was right. She'd known it the moment she'd walked to bed 7 without waiting for permission. The pericardiocentesis was brilliant medical care. It was also insubordination. It was scope of practice violation. It was every administrative violation Hargrove had been carefully documenting for 3 days, and now it had a dramatic, undeniable context. She'd saved his patient's life by breaking every protocol his compliance investigation was designed to bury her under. They'll call it an authorized procedure, Sarah said quietly. Scope violation. I overstepped. In front of the entire ICU, Clayton said. In front of Dr. Morrison. I'm guessing someone's already documenting this. He paused. His eyes held something like recognition. For what it's worth, Senior Chief, that was the best pericardiocentesis I've ever seen in a civilian setting. Second intercostal space, no imaging guidance, clean withdrawal, stable outcome. That's not nursing school. That's not protocol training. He walked away before she could respond. Sarah stood at the supply cart and finished her count, moving through the mechanical actions while the SEAL's monitor displayed a steady rhythm behind her. The heart inside his chest was no longer suffocating. The pressure had been relieved. The pericardial fluid was draining, and his oxygen saturation was maintaining at 92% despite the sedation. She'd done exactly what she was trained to do in exactly the way it needed to be done. And in approximately 6 hours, when Dr. Hargrove reviewed the shift notes and the procedure documentation, he would use that brilliance as the final, unquestionable evidence that she was a threat to the rigid hierarchy that had kept him untouchable for 16 years. The SEAL remained sedated through the evening. Sarah worked the night shift monitoring his vitals, adjusting his sedation protocols, watching the chest X-ray that confirmed what her hands had already known. The pericardial space was clear, the cardiac silhouette was normalized, the crisis had passed. His blood pressure held steady. His oxygen saturation remained in the high 80s to low 90s. His urine output was adequate. By all clinical measures, the Navy SEAL who'd been scheduled for life support withdrawal at midnight was now recovering from emergency intervention. At 2200, Sarah's shift supervisor called her into the office. She knew what was coming before she sat down. The supervisor, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Mercy General for 12 years and whose daughter was applying to military academies, wouldn't meet her eyes. Dr. Hargrove has submitted a formal incident report, Patricia said quietly. She was holding a printed document. Sarah could see the official hospital letterhead from across the desk. He's requesting an investigation into unauthorized medical procedures and scope of practice violations performed during this afternoon's shift. Sarah waited. I need to tell you officially that you're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately pending the outcome of the investigation, Patricia continued. Your access to the hospital system will be revoked. You'll need to surrender your ID badge. The fluorescent ceiling light flickered above them. Sarah noticed Patricia's hands trembling slightly as she pushed the badge across the desk. The tremor that Hargrove had, that growing evidence of something unstable in the command structure, wasn't present in Patricia's grip. Patricia was just afraid. I'm sorry, Patricia whispered. Sarah picked up her badge. The hospital ID photo showed her with a neutral expression, the way you're supposed to look when you're trying to be invisible. That woman already felt like someone from another life. The procedure saved his life, Sarah said. I know, Patricia replied. Everyone knows. The attending physician already submitted a supportive statement. So did 3 nurses. The resident who was in the room has already told his supervisor that you followed accepted emergency protocol. Sarah stood. Then Hargrove will lose, Patricia said quietly. The documentation is too clean. The outcome is too good. No rational investigation can conclude that you violated protocol when you performed a textbook emergency procedure that successfully prevented a patient death. Sarah walked toward the door. He's going to try something else, Patricia said to her back. Men like that. They don't accept losing. Not when they're this afraid. Outside the office, Sarah moved through the hallway like she'd been moving through hallways for 3 days, with the careful efficiency of someone trying to remain invisible. Her locker was at the end of the corridor. She opened it and looked at the combat boots sitting on the shelf where she'd left them. Worn leather. Dust from a place that didn't exist in hospital protocol. Laces still tied from the last time she'd removed them, which was 17 years ago in a forward operating base that was now officially listed as closed. She picked them up and held them against her chest. The seal was stable. Recovering. Awake by tomorrow probably, maybe the next day. When he woke, he wouldn't know about the compliance investigation or the administrative hearing or the way Hargrove had been building the case to destroy her career. He would only know that someone had fought for him when the system had ordered his death. Sarah closed her locker and walked out of Mercy General with her badge in her pocket and her boots in her hands, having no way of knowing that this was exactly the moment everything was about to change. Dr. Hargrove sat in his office at 0315, the fluorescent light casting his face in surgical white, and began making calls. His network activated like a machine with a single purpose: destroy the threat before it could multiply. The first call went to board member Sterling, who owed him a favor from a cardiac wing donation 3 years prior. "I need her gone by end of shift," Hargrove said, his voice steady as a blade. "Insubordination. Patient safety violation. I have documentation." Sterling didn't ask questions. The second call reached board member Hayes, then board member Bancroft. 3 calls. 3 promises. By 0330, he was on the phone with the temp agency that had placed Sarah, his tone conversational and poisonous. "I need to verify her references before we proceed with any future placements," he told the director. "Some concerns about clinical judgment have emerged during her time here." The director's voice shifted immediately, suddenly cautious, suddenly cooperative. By 0345, Hargrove had contacted the compliance office and brought in an outside investigator, a man named Fuller who specialized in medical board reviews and had successfully buried 3 previous cases that threatened institutional liability. "Every chart she's touched in the last 90 days, Hargrove instructed, sliding a folder across the desk. "I want documentation of every deviation from protocol. Every judgment call. Every instance where she might have exceeded her scope." Fuller nodded, already opening his laptop. He was good at this work. He had a family, a mortgage, and no interest in questions that might jeopardize either one. By 0400, the compliance file was already growing. Sarah's pericardiocentesis would be Exhibit A, an authorized procedure on a patient whose care team had already determined was terminal, performed without attending physician consent, equipment used without formal requisition. The narrative was already written. The only thing left was the ending. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking like a satisfied exhalation, and waited for the night to finish its work. At 0247, the SEAL's monitor showed what Sarah had been watching for since day 4, the lethal rhythm that was always coming. Asystole. A flat line. No electrical activity. No heartbeat. No hope, according to protocol. The night attending, Dr. Morrison, a man in his 50s with steady hands and a watch that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, rushed to the bedside and took over compressions. Starting code at 0247, he called out, his voice clinical and final. The respiratory therapist began bagging, pushing oxygen into lungs that weren't asking for it. A nurse pushed epinephrine into the 4-line, 1 milligram, the standard dose, the dose that had failed 1,000 times before. Morrison's hands moved in the rhythm everyone knew: 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. 6 minutes. That was the duration. The standard protocol. 6 minutes of continued resuscitation, and if no perfusing rhythm returned, you stopped. You called it. You moved on to the next patient. This was mercy. This was standard. This was how hospitals managed loss without admitting that loss was sometimes inevitable. At 0253, Dr. Morrison stopped compressions and looked at the monitor. Flat line. He had tried everything the protocol allowed. "That's it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 6 minutes and the authority of 20 years. Time of death, 0253. The respiratory therapist began disconnecting the ventilator tubing with mechanical precision. The monitor continued its monotone scream, the sound of a body giving up what it could no longer hold. Sarah appeared in the doorway at 0254, still in her scrubs, her presence sudden as a door opening inward. Morrison looked up, registering her existence with something like irritation. Chen, you're not assigned here. Go back to PEDS. His tone suggested she was contaminating a sterile field. Sarah walked to the bedside without speaking and placed her hands on the SEAL's chest, her palms finding the landmark between his ribs, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The geometry of survival burned into muscle memory from a decade of work that had nothing to do with pushing bedpans. She began compressions. 1, 2, 3. Counting aloud in a voice that had learned to be heard over helicopter rotors and artillery fire. Sarah, he's gone. It's over, Morrison said, reaching for her shoulder with a hand that meant to stop her. Sarah moved sideways with the economy of someone who had practiced this exact evasion in muscle and bone, and walked to the door. Her staff key was in her pocket. Every nurse had one for medication access, for emergency response. She turned the lock and heard the click echo like a punctuation mark. Call security, Morrison said into the phone, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had never learned that authority was fragile. Sarah returned to the bedside, and her hands resumed compressions. 30. 2 breaths from the ambu bag she squeezed herself. 30 more. Her voice stayed level. 42. 43. 44. 8 minutes. The monitor showed nothing. No rhythm. No change. Sarah reached for the crash cart and drew up another milligram of epinephrine, her movements bearing the signature of someone who had done this when 4s were running through dust and the only heartbeat that mattered was the next one. She pushed the medication and resumed compressions. The SEAL's body moved with the rhythm of her hands, a body carrying trauma that ran deeper than any bullet wound, damaged in ways that hospital charts could never capture. 9 minutes. Morrison stood frozen at the bedside, his authority crumbling in real time, watching a night shift nurse perform medicine he had declared impossible. At 10 minutes, Sarah charged the defibrillator. The machine whined as the capacitors charged, building voltage in ceramic and copper. 200 joules. The paddles were in her hands. Clear, she said, and that single word carried such absolute authority that Morrison stepped back without being touched. The current jumped across the SEAL's chest, and his body convulsed with the voltage of resurrection. At 11 minutes, the monitor showed rhythm. Not strong. Not stable. But rhythm. A heartbeat wearing the signature of someone who refused to surrender. The door alarm triggered simultaneously, and security was pounding, the sound of institutional power demanding entry. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped back, her hands falling to her sides. Morrison stared at the monitor, his face moving through shock and calculation in the space of 3 seconds. Security entered, 2 officers in grey uniforms moving with the practiced speed of men who had done this dozens of times. They didn't speak. They simply moved to Sarah, one on each side, and their hands were firm as they guided her toward the corridor. She didn't resist. Resistance would have been a choice. This was something else. This was muscle memory for a different kind of combat. By 0700, Sarah sat in the HR office across from an administrator named Collins, a woman in her 50s whose job was to administer justice while appearing sympathetic. The termination letter was already printed, the margins perfect, the typeface official and cold. Insubordination, Collins read aloud, as if Sarah couldn't read it herself. Performing procedures after death declaration has been established by the attending physician. Unauthorized access to patient care areas. Violation of hospital policy for point 7.2 regarding scope of practice. The words were already happening. They had been happening since the moment Sarah locked the door. Collins slid the letter across the desk with 2 fingers, as if the paper itself might carry contamination. In the hallway outside, Hargrove was accepting handshakes from board members Sterling and Hayes. "You maintain standards, Richard," Sterling was saying, his hand on Hargrove's shoulder in the way of men confirming their alliance. "That kind of cowboy medicine has no place in a professional institution. We're lucky you caught it." Hargrove nodded, accepting the praise the way men who have orchestrated their own victories typically do, with the modesty of someone pretending he hadn't planned every detail. The external compliance investigator, Fuller, had already delivered his preliminary report. 3 policy violations. Recommendation for State Nursing Board review. Potential blacklist from all San Diego County hospitals. The machine had done its work. The threat had been neutralized. The hierarchy had been restored. That night, at 2100 hours, Sarah sat at a bus stop on 5th Avenue with rain hammering the shelter like applause no one had asked for. A cardboard box rested on her lap, the contents of her locker, the physical sum of her identity at Mercy General. Inside, a cracked mug with "World's Okayest Nurse" printed in fading letters across ceramic so thin it was nearly translucent. A dying succulent with brown edges and limp leaves, a plant she had been keeping alive for 14 months through sheer act of will. And a photograph. A photograph of a young Marine corpsman named Rodriguez, his smile captured in sunlight and desert dust, his eyes carrying the kind of light that only existed before people learned what bodies looked like when they stopped working. They had called him Rabbit. They had called her Phantom. They had worked a convoy route called Route Irish for 40 minutes while insurgents fired from 3 positions, and when the last wounded Marine had been loaded and the last rounds had been fired, she had still been breathing. Rodriguez had not. The rain soaked through her jacket in patterns that resembled stains she had never been able to wash out completely. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She simply sat holding a box containing the wreckage of her second life, the one she had chosen, the one she had believed would be quieter than the first. The rain continued. The bus was late. Everything was late. Everything was already over before it had time to begin. Day 6 at 14:30, the SEAL's eyes opened. Not slowly. Not confused. Fully conscious, suddenly awake like someone had flipped a switch behind his pupils, and his hand moved with the speed of muscle memory trained into his bones. He reached for the endotracheal tube. His fingers found it. And he pulled. The ventilator's alarm screamed into the ICU like a wounded animal. Nurses converged. The attending physician rushed in with hands already reaching. But the tube was out, the SEAL was breathing on his own, shallow at first, then deeper, then the color flooded back into his face like someone had restored the saturation on a photograph. His chest rose and fell without mechanical assistance. His lungs remembered how. The neurologist arrived 90 seconds later with Hargrove following 2 steps behind, and that's when the SEAL's eyes moved. Not to the doctors. Not to the monitors showing O2 sat climbing through 94, 96, 98. His gaze locked on the corner of the room where Sarah's boots sat on the shelf above the locker. Worn combat boots with sand still embedded in the treads from 3 deployments in Kandahar province. Laces wrapped through the eyelets in a military wrap that nobody else would recognize, but somebody would. Somebody was recognizing it right now. The SEAL's lips moved. One word. Barely audible. Phantom. The room went still. The monitors kept their rhythm, beep, 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 but nobody moved, nobody spoke. The neurologist's pen hovered over his chart. Hargrove's face had gone the color of hospital walls. Within the hour, the SEAL's daughter arrived through the automatic doors of the ER, and she walked straight to bed 7 like she'd been waiting 6 days for her legs to remember how to move. She stood at the rail, her hand finding his, and when she spoke her voice carried the weight of someone who'd been holding power of attorney for a man whose life had hung on a single nursing decision. Senior Chief. A nurse checking the updated file found it while the daughter stood there, the recommendation form, 3 pages deep in the digital archive, flagged and categorized but never read during the code. Sarah's Navy Cross recommendation. The nurse's hands trembled as she announced it, right there in the hallway where Hargrove could hear every syllable. 15 minutes later, the SEAL's team leader walked through the doors. Not a visitor. Not a consultant. A senior enlisted advisor from the naval base, still wearing his dress uniform because he'd come straight from San Diego, and he looked at the boots in the corner the way a soldier looks at a fallen brother's rucksack. He knew. Silver Star, he said, his voice steady and ceremonial. The hospital administrator who'd been standing near the window turned to face him. Bronze Star with Valor. The administrator's expression shifted, not quite understanding yet, but something in his posture changed, a stiffening like a man realizing he'd been standing on thin ice the entire time. 2 Purple Hearts. The SEALs team leader turned to face the administrator directly now, and his eyes held something that made even strong men step backward. And the corpsman who held root Irish for 40 minutes alone. Who ran a pericardiocentesis in a trauma bay without authorization because every doctor in this hospital had given up. Who locked a door and kept working. The administrator backed silently out of the room. He didn't wait for the 4th medal. Didn't need to. His hand reached for the doorframe to steady himself as he turned and walked, his pace quickening as he moved toward the administrative wing. By 1800 hours, the hospital board had convened an emergency meeting. By 2100 hours, every board member who'd taken Hargrove's calls was being contacted by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They had questions about a Navy SEAL's family contact information that was marked as disconnected when it was active, about life support withdrawal orders that proceeded without proper family notification, about whether a compliance investigator's audit had been influenced by institutional loyalty rather than patient safety. The compliance investigator's report was suddenly flagged as under review. One board member who'd promised Hargrove 3 favors issued a statement about it concerning irregularities in ICU protocols. Another requested an immediate review of every DNR order Hargrove had authorized in the past 24 months. The temp agency released Sarah's full employment file. She disclosed her military service and her PTSD diagnosis, had requested night shifts specifically to manage her mental health, and nobody at Mercy General had bothered to read past the basic verification box. The cafeteria incident was on security camera footage. High definition. Timestamp, 0632 hours. Hargrove's leg extending, Sarah's tray falling, his smile so satisfied that it looked like an admission of guilt in slow motion. The contract medic from Camp Pendleton filed a formal witness statement. The procedure she performed was textbook combat medicine. She saved that man's life. 2 nurses came forward about the humiliation pattern. The reassignments. The public mocking. The power dynamic weaponized like a gun. At the emergency board meeting, held in the hospital's executive conference room at 1400 hours on day 7, Hargrove attempted to defend his clinical judgment. He cited protocol. He cited standard of care. He cited his 23 years of experience in critical care medicine. But the SEAL's daughter was on the video conference call, and she waited until he finished his prepared statement, then spoke with the kind of clarity that only comes from knowing you'd almost lost everything. Dr. Hargrove ordered my father's life support withdrawn without contacting me. I had power of attorney. That's not clinical judgment, doctor. That's negligence. That's possibly criminal. The hospital's legal counsel leaned over and whispered something to the board chair. The meeting lasted for more minutes. By 1600 hours, Hargrove's office was being cleared by facility staff. By 1630 hours, he was processing his termination paperwork in human resources, his hand shaking as he signed away his access badge and parking permit and hospital email account. And at 1647 hours, the same security guard who'd escorted Sarah Chen out of the building 7 days prior appeared in Hargrove's office doorway with a cardboard box. The same kind of cardboard box. The same weight to it. He set it on the desk with deliberate care. The guard met Hargrove's eyes, really met them, held them, didn't look away, and said, "I believe you know the way out, sir." 2 months later. Sarah walked down National City Boulevard wearing her Navy working uniform, pressed blues with her cover at regulation angle and her ribbons displayed in perfect rows. The Silver Star medal sat on her chest like a question that had finally received an answer. Her pace was measured, purposeful, the gait of someone who'd relearned how to exist in daylight. The rain from the morning had left the sidewalk wet, and her dress shoes made a precise tapping sound against the concrete, percussion marking the distance between what had been and what would be. She passed a strip mall. Her reflection ghosted across the storefront windows. Vape shop. Tax service. And between them, a folding table with a hand-painted banner, supplemental health insurance, ask me how. Hargrove sat in a plastic chair, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo that probably cost him more than whatever commission structure he was working under. He was explaining something to an elderly couple who looked profoundly confused. His hands moved across a brochure, and Sarah could see from the sidewalk what the couple couldn't: the tremor. The fine trembling that comes from knowing exactly what you've lost and exactly why you lost it. She paused. Her reflection in the glass was clear enough that when his eyes lifted and found hers, the recognition was immediate and total. 3 seconds. They held the gaze for 3 seconds, and Sarah didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't offer a single acknowledgement beyond presence. Just held his eyes the way someone holds the moment before they pull a trigger or give an order or decide someone's fate. Then she continued walking. Naval Base Coronado was 16 minutes south. The training program had been established specifically for Sarah's arrival, a specialty course in emergency field medicine taught by someone who'd lived it, survived it, and earned the medals to prove it. Her classroom filled with young sailors and Marines, 19-year-olds with soft hands who'd signed their names on lines that might lead them to Baghdad or Kandahar or places that didn't exist on official maps, and they listened to Sarah the way people listen to someone who's already stared at death and then turned around and told death to wait. She taught them the needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She taught them emergency cricothyrotomy through the cricothyroid membrane when the airway was closing and the clock was counting down. She taught them how to run a pericardiocentesis when the pericardium was filling with blood and the heart was drowning and every attending physician had walked away. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior, she told them in her 3rd lesson, and every student in that room knew she wasn't reading from a textbook. You need only the courage to stay when others walk away, and the strength to keep fighting when the world calls time of death. In her office hung the photograph of her corpsman partner, the one who didn't make it out of Baghdad. Beside it, in a new frame, hung the official commendation letter from the base commander. And on the shelf, the boots, Sarah's boots, worn through 3 deployments, the sand still embedded in the treads. The MacGuffin that had been a secret and then, for 6 days, an answer. The SEAL recovered fully. He returned to active duty. And when he needed trained combat medics for his new command, he personally requested the senior chief from Mercy General, the one who'd locked the door when everyone else had given up, who'd kept working when the clock had stopped, who'd understood that heroism isn't about medals or rank or the kind of recognition that comes from people who've never had to choose between following orders and following conscience. Subscribe, like, and comment if this story reminded you that true strength often walks among us in places we'd never think to look.